A chat about the situation in Iran, and Neil Ferguson revealed some of his exclusive sources telling him that there could be an imminent US military intervention in Iran. The Prime Minister's come back from the G7, you were part of a Cobra meeting. What would be the British government's involvement, if anything, if the US does decide to militarily intervene in Iran?
We want to see a de-escalation, not an escalation of hostilities in the Middle East. I don't think it's in anyone's interest to see an escalation. Too much is at stake, and the Prime Minister made that case when he was in Canada earlier this week, and as a government we continue to do so. At the same time, we have moved assets into the region, as you know, including Typhoon jets. We do have bases, we do have personnel in the region, and as a government, of course, we always want to protect our interests, and so that's why we've made those decisions to move those assets there in the case of them being needed.
And your job at the Treasury, have you started gaming the economic impacts of what perhaps what looks like a full-blown regional war would have on the UK economy, UK businesses and UK consumers? Well,
I think you'd all expect that at all times we're monitoring situations around the world and the impact that they may have. At the moment, we're particularly monitoring what's happening to oil prices, for example. But so far, I think things have been broadly contained. But yeah, of course, we're monitoring the situation very closely.
And is oil prices the main channel of concern? And is that a concern about inflation, effectively?
Well, so far, I wouldn't say that we are overly concerned about the movements we've seen to date. Obviously, the concern would be that the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and or at least that trade is disrupted, which would have both an impact on oil, but also on wider movements of goods, as we've seen in the past. So that would be the thing that we would be particularly concerned about. But so far, we are not overly concerned, but monitoring the situation carefully.
You were here last year. I remember it quite well. I think there was a lot of hope, a lot of optimism in this room. We, at that time, ended up just being a few weeks before a general election. My colleague Dom, I think, went round this morning and sort of did a sort of straw poll asking everyone in the room whether Labour was still a pro-business party, and I think it was a slightly lukewarm reaction. A lot seems to have changed. I mean, what's the kind of pitch to everyone in this room now, given everything that's happened over the last year? I think some of that goodwill has evaporated. How are you planning to win all these guys back?
I think when I was here last year, I said the number one job for an incoming Labour government would be to return stability to the economy after the turbulence we've had really sort of for the previous decade, to be honest. And I think that we have achieved that. It's not easy. We faced a situation when I became Chancellor, as you all know, of an awful lot of unfunded spending commitments. There hadn't been a spending review for 3 or 4 years. Obviously, since then, there'd been big inflationary pressures, which of course affect the public sector as well as the private sector. And we had to make a number of decisions very quickly. I will defend those decisions robustly because if we're going to return stability to the economy, you have to make sure the sums add up. And that meant a number of difficult decisions on tax, welfare and on spending. But, the OBR have done 2 forecasts since I became Chancellor. In both of those forecasts, they confirm that we will meet the fiscal rules that we've set, the stability rule to balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts. That hasn't happened for years. And then also the investment rule to get debt down as a share of our economy, but subject to that, to be able to make the investments to grow our economy, because growth and productivity have really been the missing ingredients of the UK economy, really since the financial crisis. So getting on for 2 decades now. And some of the choices we've made, whether that's the pensions reform to deepen capital markets in the UK, the regulatory reforms to remove some of those burdens that business face, the planning reforms to make it easier to get stuff built in Britain, the creation of a national wealth fund, putting more money into the British Business Bank to try and leverage in that private sector investment, and of course the 3 trade deals that we have secured in the last couple of months. We now have the best trade deal of any country in the world with India. We are the only country in the world to have a trade deal with the United States, and we have improved our trading relations with the European Union, which I believe makes Britain a very attractive place to invest or to grow your business.
Some of those difficult decisions around tax obviously included employer NICs. That's probably one of the reasons that I think some of the goodwill may have evaporated in this room towards you. We heard recently from a former member of the OBR's executive committee that NICs is probably having more of a damage on the labour market than the OBR expected in the autumn, so they put an estimate of something around 50,000 jobs. It looks like, given recent developments in the labour market, that maybe NICs will have much more of an impact on slowing down the labour market. So do you recognise that it may have had a bigger intended consequences? And are you planning anything to really ameliorate or cushion the impact on the labour market from your decision to raise employer NICs?
So I absolutely recognise that every policy choice we make as a government has an impact. But let's look at the counterfactual. If we hadn't have increased national insurance contributions, we either would have had to increase other taxes, including taxes on working people. Now, we've seen today the BRC survey of consumer confidence shows consumer confidence at its highest level in a year. That's very good for businesses, especially consumer-facing businesses. If we hadn't have increased taxes elsewhere, we would have had to borrow more, and that would have meant we were not able to meet our fiscal rules. We've got a headroom of 10 billion. The NICs increase raises just over 20 billion. So we couldn't have met that commitment to return stability to the economy if we hadn't have made those decisions. And I don't honestly think we would have had 4 interest rate cuts this last year if we hadn't have made some of those difficult decisions, or we would have had to have cut spending. And in the spending review last week, we have increased spending, particularly for the health service, but also for defence and also for investment in infrastructure. I think in the changing world that we face today, I doubt if there's anyone in this room that doesn't think that we should be increasing what we spend on defence. But also I expect that pretty much everyone in this room recognises when you've got almost 8 million people on NHS waiting lists, we do need to get those down. Now, that's not just about money, absolutely not, and no one understands that better than Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. But you've got to have investment alongside reform. We've brought down NHS waiting lists by 250,000 in the first few months of this government. That means more people available to work. I know that recruitment is often a challenge for business. So yes, we made that decision. I stand by that decision because I think when you judge is something the right thing to do, you have to look at all of the other options. And I believe in the circumstances we faced as an incoming government, that was the right decision. It wasn't something that I was planning to do when I became Chancellor, but I do think in the circumstances, the fiscal position that we inherited, it was the right decision. And I've sort of said this before to some of you, but you know, many of you have taken over in businesses that were struggling. And when you are in that position, you can either say, right, okay, I'm going to do everything straight away to try and put this business back on a firm footing, or I'll take some incremental steps now and then come back next year and then the year after that. But we as a government, me as Chancellor, decided that we were going to wipe the slate clean, we were going to fix the mess that we inherited, which then enables us to move forward. And it means that you can be confident that we made the decisions then in that budget to put our public finances back on a firm footing. We've now set spending plans for the next few years, for the remainder really of this Parliament, and public services now need to live within those budgets that we've set.
And is this now a promise that no more payroll taxes, no more burdens on employers?
Well, look, I don't think that it would be responsible to try and write another 4 years worth of budgets before we even got to the end of the first year of this Labour government. And you started this conversation about the instability that we are seeing in the world. Well, the world is changing. We can see that all around us. And I think it would be very irresponsible to say, you know, this is the policy for the rest of this Parliament. But we made these commitments around the taxes that working people pay. And we also also made a commitment around corporation tax, and we made those commitments in our manifesto, and we plan to stick to those commitments.
You mentioned the OBR, and of course part of your government's sort of, when it came into office, was to sort of elevate the OBR back to a respected position after maybe one short-lived Prime Minister was a little bit dismissive of them.
Yeah.
The OBR has said that you are meeting your fiscal rules by one of the thinnest buffers on record. But we also know that the OBR is in an active process of thinking about its own forecasts, which have been consistently over-optimistic. And in a couple of weeks, probably in early July, there may be a moment where the OBR says that its most crucial projection, which is about future productivity growth, has just been too over-optimistic. And at a stroke, it can wipe away tens of billions of pounds from your headroom. So are you waiting with bated breath about what that decision is? And depending on how sort of extreme that revision is your entire fiscal plan going to have to be ripped up between now and the autumn?
Well, let me first start by saying something about economic institutions, because I think this is an important part and was an important part of the pitch we made in the general election campaign a year ago. You know, the two Prime Ministers ago, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor sacked the respected Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, undermined the Bank of England, and refused to allow the Office of Budget Responsibility to do a forecast. And that, combined with the unfunded tax cuts that they promised, caused our economy to crash, interest rates to go through the roof, pensions were put in peril, and I've promised never to play fast and loose with the public finances, but also to respect those economic institutions that are there for a reason, to provide checks and balances in the system. And it'd be, you know, very easy, I guess, to say, you know, I'm not going to have an OBR report because that's, you know, difficult information that I really don't want to confront. But that would be the wrong choice. That would be irresponsible. And so we do, as a government, respect those independent economic institutions. But the second thing I would say is this government is not passive in waiting for, you know, the verdict of an independent forecaster. You know, we're getting on with the job of doing the things that businesses have told us they want to see to boost our long-term productivity and growth potential. So the regulatory changes, changing the leadership team at the CMA. I've got Nikhil here from the FCA. I'm sure that he would confirm that you know, we're very clear about the role of the regulators, and we want to regulate for growth, not just for risk. And I think that's something that that Nikhil and other regulators have really taken to heart. All of us in public service and all of us, I think, in business know that the UK economy has not achieved its potential for too long, and we've got to change the way that we do things. So the regulatory reforms, the planning reforms, which the OBR scored as improving our growth potential. The planning and infrastructure bill will get royal assent by the end of this year. We're absolutely determined to steer it through, including the House of Lords, where opposition might be a bit more strong against some of the plans to get Britain building. The pensions bill that Torsten Bell is going to be taking through Parliament in the weeks and months ahead to consolidate those DC and local government pension schemes. You know, we are not passive as a government. We are active at removing those barriers that have held back business, investment and productivity for too long, at the same time as really championing Britain as a place to invest and a place to trade from through those trade deals.
Sure. I guess the most important independent regulator that is in charge of the short-run fortunes of the economy is actually the Bank of England. And I haven't checked my phone, but I'm pretty sure the Bank of England has not cut interest rates this afternoon. You said that we've had 4 interest rate cuts. We probably were expecting much more. Your autumn budget was contingent on there being a faster pace of monetary loosening. Are you disappointed that the Bank of England doesn't seem to want to help you out in your growth mission?
Well, just refer to my last answer that we respect independent economic institutions, and you know the bank has got an incredibly important but difficult job to do, and we want them to set the monetary policy that is appropriate for meeting the inflation target, because we also saw in the last Parliament a double-digit inflation, which was so challenging for businesses, but also family finances, which also has a knock-on impact on business. But we've had 4 cuts. That is a world away from the previous Parliament, when interest rates went up so sharply because of the poor economic mismanagement of Prime Ministers and Chancellors.
Sure. I guess my broader point is that you've constructed a fiscal rule framework in which so many of the variables you're not in control of. You don't control interest rates, you don't control gilt yields, you don't really control the geopolitical environment, you don't control the savings rate, you don't control business and consumer sentiment, not directly. I mean, have you just fallen into the same trap that Jeremy Hunt has fallen into? Is that the fiscal rules, there are only certain things in which you can really make levers that you can pull, but ultimately you are at the mercy of things that you can't control, and therefore you're always having to react, which is why we're always constantly talking about which spending cuts or which tax rises are going to happen. I mean, was it a mistake to design the fiscal rules in such a way that you're actually, again, whim to
But the fiscal
to the
rules
variables?
only really reflect like the sort of economic and fiscal reality. Fine, we could borrow more, we could change the fiscal rules to borrow more. Well, what would happen? Well, gilt yields would go up more. So the cost of servicing the whole stock of debt goes up. So the fiscal rules aren't a sort of construct that we pulled out of thin air. They're to meet the real constraints that exist. That if we want to borrow, somebody has to be willing to buy those bonds. And when I became Chancellor, the debt to GDP ratio almost 100%. The OBR say it's forecast to fall during the course of this Parliament, and that's a good thing. Of course, you could have different fiscal rules, but they would come with a cost, and the cost would be higher borrowing costs, which would risk wiping out the benefit you'd get from being able to borrow more. So, I think the fiscal rules, is it sensible to say that you pay for day-to-day spending through tax receipts? Yes. That is a very sensible fiscal rule. It's not something that this country has achieved for many years, but I don't think it's right to say that future generations should pay for the spending like businesses do for the long term to build the infrastructure, that will be that benefit will be felt by future generations. So the fiscal rules make sense economically, but they also reflect the fiscal realities. It would be great to be in a different world where I'd inherited a debt to GDP ratio of 50%, that we had a lower debt burden, that our day-to-day spending needs weren't so great, that our public services weren't in such a mess. But, you don't get to choose your inheritance as a government or as Chancellor. This is my inheritance. I am dealing with it by putting our public finances on a firm footing, trying to make sure that the tax burden doesn't have to be any greater than it needs to be, but that we also improve our public services, including through that crucial infrastructure investment to boost our energy security, our national security through defence and all the rest of it.
Let's talk about energy security and these other things. There's an industrial strategy which is imminent. You've said many times before it's important where things are made and which people make those things. But only this week, I think the UK's largest fiberglass manufacturer, probably the only one in Wigan, was allowed to go bust because its Japanese owners decided to shutter it. And when people came in to try and rescue it and asked the government, or the Treasury in this case, for some financing guarantees, the Treasury said no. I mean, how are we supposed to take this idea that you really truly believe in an industrial strategy, which can often mean doing things like providing subsidies against foreign competition, if when there is a request, like happened in Wigan this week, the answer is no from the Treasury?
Well, the answer can't always be yes, and I think my cabinet colleagues would attest to that. So, we can't always say yes, even if there are things that we might like to do and we might like the situation to be different. But take, British Steel, for example. That was it's our only virgin steel making capacity left in the UK. The materials had not been ordered to keep that blast furnace open, and so we stepped in as a government and took control of the company. And Network Rail have just done a deal with British Steel that as they build out that network that we're investing in as a country, they will use British Steel to do so. If British Steel had closed, we would have had to import that steel to build the infrastructure that our country needs. Similarly, Heathrow, where we're backing that third runway, wants to use British Steel for the construction. They wouldn't be able to if British Steel had folded. So we have got an active industrial strategy. You'll see more details of that next week. But I think crucially, this is an industrial strategy that has been co-written with business. Claire Barclay from Microsoft chaired the Industrial Strategy Council. I expect that many of you in this room have been engaged in the writing of that industrial strategy for sectors from life sciences to defence, advanced manufacturing, and also financial services and business services too.
But I'm interested in when the answer is yes and when the answer is no. So if we go back to fiberglass, I mean, fiberglass is a material that is used in wind turbines it's basically a fundamental component in clean energy. This should be exactly, to the T, the kind of industries that this government should be helping to support. So I still don't understand why the answer was no.
I'm not going to go into the individual circumstances of a business. We've got to know that there is a viable future for it. What the alternatives are. In the case of steel, we would have been importing steel from China. We think it's important that we preserve that capacity here in the UK, and that was the right thing to do. But we have these special situations very regularly, and if we stepped in every case, that would not be affordable, and so we can't do it.
You mentioned China. I mean, one of the reasons that these businesses are not able to compete is because there is a behemoth called China which dominates so much of the supply chain in these technologies. We were in Washington a couple of months ago, and you stood in the UK embassy and you said that it's not right that China, a country like China, generates a massive surplus, especially when they do so by bending the rules of the free trading system. And you said that Donald Trump was actually correct in his diagnosis about why it's too dangerous to have massive deficit countries and massive surplus countries. You said the UK was a deficit country and the UK needs to change and not become a deficit country. How does the UK stop becoming a deficit country?
Well, I want to do more to buy, make and sell more here in Britain. The intervention in British Steel is an example of that. You'll see in the industrial strategy next week policies to try and support the competitiveness of businesses in the UK, making Britain the best place to start and grow a business, with the trade policy that we're pursuing to ensure that we have advantageous trade relations with some of the biggest economies around the world. And, you know, with China, I was there in January with my opposite number, Vice Premier He Lifeng, and we signed deals during that economic and financial dialogue worth something like £600 million a year for British businesses, particularly in financial services. So we want to have, a good relationship with China, but we don't want it to be all one way. And I do think it matters where things are made and who makes them. We are investing heavily in defence. There are countries around the world that are also stepping up their defence spending. I want British businesses. We are, we can be a defence industrial superpower. I want those orders to come to British firms, but that means we need the supply chain there to build them. But we'll have more to say about that in the industrial strategy next week.
Well, Donald Trump's answer to shrinking his deficit with China is by having an incredibly aggressive trade posturing towards China.
And obviously our approach is very different. Okay. Well, our approach is very different. So, we want to see trade barriers with countries around the world fall. That's why we've just done a comprehensive deal with India that sees trade barriers, including tariffs, fall both ways. Particularly in the case of exports for whisky and car manufacturing, but also the tariffs we apply to imports from India. It's a balanced deal. I think it's worth something like 0.1% of GDP, can create good jobs here in Britain as we export around the world. Similarly, the economic and financial dialogue and the concrete outcomes we secured from that, including the first sovereign green bond issued on the London Stock Exchange in April this year, shows that we can have good relations with the second biggest economy in the world, China, whilst also protecting those things which I think are absolutely essential for our national security and domestic security.
Last one to me, and then I'll go to the room. We've hit on Trump, but I'm going to end a little bit with Trump. So another way that Donald Trump wants to achieve his vaunted rebalancing is not just by penalising trade flows, but also by penalising capital flows. And we know that there is a provision in the Big Beautiful Bill, which is this idea of revenge taxes. The US administration can have the authority to impose revenge taxes on companies based in countries that the president feels are being discriminatory towards American companies. I mean, have you had a conversation with the US Treasury about what these potential discriminatory taxes are, and how does the UK avoid being caught up in the revenge tax plan?
So first of all, Britain does not have discriminatory taxes. Our taxes are agnostic about which country things come from. But we do recognise that the US have concerns around some of our tax policy, and we're working through those. I have spoken to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent directly about these issues when he was in Downing Street a couple of weeks ago, just ahead of the US-China trade talks, and we spoke about a number of issues, including particularly this issue. The British Embassy in Washington are also heavily involved in talking to Congress, but even if this legislation is passed, it will be at the discretion of the US Treasury how it is applied, and we will make the case very strongly on behalf of the UK economy and on behalf of British businesses that this should not be applied to us, and that lobbying work and that making that case will continue. We want to understand, and we do understand, some of the concerns the US have. We're working through those, but it would not be right to target UK companies.
Is the digital services tax and the OECD Pillar 2 multinational tax, which is due to come in on January 1, are those both sort of on the block now, something that you have to reconsider?
Well, the US absolutely recognise that it's the preserve of the UK government to set tax policy for the UK. So we're working through their concerns, and hopefully we'll find a way through this. But at all times, this government will stand up for British interests and British businesses in all of our negotiations.